My name is Connor Ransom. I'm the Conservation Associate at Environment Virginia. Thank you, everybody, for joining today to learn about protecting Virginia's wildlife and drivers. We're going to talk about wildlife crossings in Virginia, hear from some great panelists, and um, talk about how you can get involved and have a chance for you to ask questions at the end. So if you go to the next slide, Ellie, we can go over the agenda quickly. So first, we're going to have trauma surgeon Dan Lawler from Roanoke, or based in Roanoke, talk about the human impacts of wildlife-vehicle conflict. We're going to have Professor John Swaddle from William and Mary's Institute for Integrative Conservation talk about their research in Loudoun County. We're going to learn about aquatic passages from Ben at Trout Unlimited, and then hear about some of the history of crossing policy from Misty and Wildlands Network. I'll talk about our current policy goals, and Environment Virginia's intern, Nick, will talk about how you can get involved by writing a letter to the editor. So you can write your questions in the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and then we'll have time at the end to go back and answer them. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dan to talk about um, the human impacts of wildlife vehicle conflicts.
Thanks, Connor. Yeah, my name's Dan Lawler. I'm a trauma surgeon at Crillian Clinic in Roanoke. Sorry for the background noise. We work in Roanoke is basically the regional trauma center for Southwest Virginia and parts of West Virginia as well. And my background was basically I was born in Atlanta. I trained in Fresno, California, in Denver, Colorado. I saw a lot of motor vehicle crashes. I saw a lot of people hit by cars, certainly plenty of gun violence. But the idea of having wildlife or particularly deer versus automobile conflicts as particularly high on my radar was just not there. Until about maybe 5 years ago, I had a case that was really pretty impactful. We had a 17-year-old girl who was driving home from work in Blacksburg, and she hit a deer. She wasn't drinking, she wasn't distracted, she wasn't high. The deer basically just came in through her windshield and hit her in the head. Um, she was knocked unconscious. EMS responded. She was still unconscious when they got there, so they put a breathing tube down and brought her to us. We basically took her to the CT scanner. She had a pretty severe traumatic brain injury. We called the neurosurgeons. They really did everything they could for her, but she ultimately progressed to brain death. Basically all brain function was gone. And so she progressed to being a brain donor. An organ donor. She gave her kidney, she gave her liver, and her lungs. Um, and I remember standing in the hallway from the ICU down to the operating room, where we basically sort of stand as a ceremony to honor the people that are giving these gifts, and just thinking about what the family, what the parents must be thinking about, that their little girl is, gone basically through no fault of her own, and really through no fault of anybody else. I mean, I think at some level we understand if it was a drunk driver or something like that, that makes a certain amount of sense, as tragic as it is. But this really sort of felt very arbitrary and random. And so I started kind of paying attention more to the people on my service, and trying to kind of make an informal list of um, how many of my patients were actually involved in these deer versus car collisions or motorcycles. And one of the things I noticed relatively quickly was that pretty much for every patient that had hit a deer, there was one that had swerved to miss a deer and had driven off the road. And So after a bit of time, I talked with our the folks that run our trauma database and basically collect data on every trauma patient that comes through our doors, and kind of talked to her about looking retrospectively at our patient population. And it was interesting because she kind of indicated there wasn't great ways to identify these folks. And over 3 years, she was able to identify about 40, I think 42 or so. But what struck me was that when I looked at my list and when I looked at her list, there wasn't a whole lot of overlap. So a lot of the people that were involved, or again were had sort of wrecked because of deer without actually hitting deer, um, weren't really being captured and recorded. And so I started looking at some other sources of data, and certainly came across data that looked at insurance data on collisions, police reports, and carcass data, and it certainly seemed to suggest that um, it's a very common incident and very much underrecorded. Um, and when I looked back at our own data, what I saw was that it was also very impactful that of those patients that we had identified, 3 of them had died. A third of them ended up in the ICU, and the injuries that they sustained were very significant. They were traumatic brain injuries. They were um, open fractures. They were lung rib fractures and punctured lungs. Um, and so I started to think about what we could do to kind of mitigate these things, and we're associated with Virginia Tech, and I thought, well, we could come up with some nifty doohickey that would address this and kind of fix the problem, and quickly realized that we've come up with a lot of doohickeys, and they work for a little bit and then they don't. And so um, as I learned more, I really felt like the data suggested that the only reliable way to help prevent these collisions was with wildlife corridors. And I'm sure for many of you that was obvious, but it was certainly eye-opening for me. And so I kind of moved from being research minded about this in terms of, how do we address this problem, to really being advocacy minded and saying, well, I think we have the data that we need to support that this is a common problem and it's a very dangerous problem. And we know how to fix it. We just need the money and the political will to do it. And so that's kind of why I'm here, and how I got involved in this.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's some sobering stories, but important to hear and think about the impacts that these can have on individuals and families. So now I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about the research that he's been doing and hopefully learns a little bit about some of the solutions to this problem.
Great. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Ellie, for the invitation. And thanks, Dan, for telling those stories too as well, which are, really important to keep at the forefront. So I want to do a couple of things. I want to talk about the Institute for Integrative Conservation a little bit and what we are and what we do, and then get into the project which we've been working with Department of Wildlife Resources and Jordan Green in Loudoun County. So next slide. So to frame the Institute for Integrative Conservation, this infographic is trying to capture what we mean by integrative conservation. In the center of this picture is a mixture between human development and nature, other parts of nature. We take the view that integrative conservation is about the connections between people and the rest of nature, that people are very much part of nature rather than being separated from. And the way that we look at that is this lens around the outside through 2 human aspects of human well-being, which directly relates to road crossings and safety, and local community perspectives. If you click next, in a broader view, ecosystems are vital for human society. all forms of life depend upon each other. Even if you take a very utilitarian point of view, most of the economic activity on the planet is directly related to nature. So we need a flourishing planet full of life to support human society. And that's what the Institute is about trying to preserve the life on the planet and reverse the extinction crisis that we're in right now. Next slide. And one of the programs that we run is this conservation research program, where we put out an RFP for people to respond to, like NGOs, like Environment Virginia, where you tell us what your conservation challenges are. And then we put together a team from the university, from any part of the university, to try to then work on that challenge for a year. If you click next. And so what we do is we put together teams of faculty and students from across the university to co-design the project, to work on it intensively during the summer, and then pull it all together in the fall and produce whatever deliverables are meaningful for you that will move the needle forwards for the conservation challenge you're trying to address. And it's possible that you can follow up year on year with this type of system too as well. And that's exactly what we've done for these road crossings projects. Next slide. So in the first year of working with Department of Wildlife Resources and the marvelous Jordan Green, who I know is one of the attendees here, we've worked for 3 years with him. Initially, Alexa Busby, one of the students, led the project on identifying hotspots for road crossings and collisions, but well, roadkill in particular in Loudoun County in Virginia. Click next. And then we sort of bifurcated the project the next year, where Kaylee and Sophia worked on 2 different aspects. Kaylee worked more on the human decision-making parts of what factors go into deciding how to invest in road crossing structures and who's involved in that. And Sophia focused more on the wildlife components, understanding what wildlife are using the crossing structures that Alexa identified as hotspots for problems in terms of road safety. If you click next. And then currently, Percy and Taylor, who are also on the call, are following up on those 2 strands of human and wildlife-oriented projects, where Percy is further understanding how you can build grassroots support to build pressure on entities like VDOT to invest more in road crossings, safe road crossings. And then Taylor is doing now a soundscape analysis to really understand from the wildlife's point of view how they experience approaching a road crossing structure and then use it, because we know that road noise can deter wildlife from using these structures. Next slide. So in terms of using this information to prioritize where to invest, we can integrate data across multiple different sources. So in the first year, DWR and the Virginia WCAP had data around roadkills. We augmented that with a community-based app where people reported roadkill data, combined with the camera traps of what's actually used in the crossing structures. Then you can understand what's happening at the road level and under the road. And then the sensory data that Taylor is currently collecting and analyzing helps you understand how they experience the crossing structure. And then that can be combined to understand where to prioritize and how to enhance the crossing structures themselves. If you click next. So we've identified 10 hotspots for problems, and that map is currently being used by Loudoun County, which is great. Within this as well, we're at the stage of sort of prioritizing within those 10 hotspots based on the biodiversity that's using them, but also, as Dan was indicating, the high-risk species like deer. Where are they most too as well within this system? We've also tested some workflows about other people using similar technologies like camera traps and acoustic sensors to then do this and replicate this elsewhere. And the soundscape analysis is indicating that there may be some low-cost, low-maintenance ways of improving the experience for the wildlife to funnel them more towards using these crossing structures. Next slide. So this is Alexa's map of hotspots in Loudoun County, Virginia. And then within those hotspots, there are some camera icons to indicate where Sophia did the camera trap studies to understand the wildlife using the same crossing structures. And Taylor has been going back to those same camera sites to do the soundscape analysis. So this is the kind of product that this leads to in terms of prioritization. Next slide. So here's some images from the 2 prioritized areas, Purcellville 1 and 2, both in the same sort of area. They were both high in biodiversity, but they were also really high in the high-risk collision species, deer. So we created this sort of risk factor metric as well, along with biodiversity metrics. And interestingly, there was a site among the hotspots, Belmont, that had really high species diversity, but the lowest amount of risk because the lowest amount of deer we use in that area. So in terms of how you then weight your decision making, you're looking for areas with high biodiversity and the high risk as your top priority areas where you might want to enhance the crossing structures. Next slide. On the more sort of human decision-making strand, we wanted to understand who was involved, the constituent map of who was making decisions and influencing the decisions about investing in crossing structures, and understand what motivates them, what are the key incentives, what are the barriers to change, and then trying to lead to particular plans that would influence people's behavior in different ways on this constituent map to move in the direction of investing in crossing structures. Click next. And so far, we've built this constituent map. It's available through our website, and I can certainly share that with everybody. And what we found, unsurprisingly, that funding was key, but also pressure from the public is really key, which really leads to the work of NGOs like Environment Virginia, that grassroots support really matters in terms of putting pressure on this whole system. And we've also been analyzing case studies from other states to see what can be transferred to Virginia to move us faster in a direction of investing in safe road crossing structures. Next slide. So the work that we're currently sort of finishing up and then going into a fourth year of collaboration with DWR is to then extrapolate beyond the sites that we've worked at on the ground, probably using GIS to augment the modeling work that's already happening to then prioritize other places within the state. And that might be also associated with some new ground truth data too as well, to ultimately contribute to the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan in Virginia with these types of prioritization types of data. Click next. And on the human side, we want to build a specific behavior-centered design model for how we can influence the behavior of key actors within the constituent map so that we can build strategies, informational campaigns, behavior change campaigns around actually moving people towards making decisions to invest in safe road crossing structures. Next slide. So if you'd like to follow up, happy to talk to anybody, happy to share any of the information that we have as we sort of work collectively. And in particular, I'm really want to this year really work with many of the NGOs in Virginia to think about how we can bring this information together to form some action plans. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Oh, my camera turned off. I'm not sure why. Oh, there it is. So now we're gonna turn it over to Ben from Trout Unlimited to shift gears a little bit and think about aquatic passages, an area that I think a lot of people maybe don't think about when they think about wildlife crossings, but is also really important for wildlife connectivity.
Yeah, thank you. Today we're going to talk about aquatic organism passage at road stream crossings. Next slide. And whenever I talk about aquatic organism passage, I always like to highlight the aquatic organisms that we're talking about. And so here in Virginia, we have species such as shad and herring that start their lives in freshwater systems and then move out to saltwater systems and then come back to freshwater to spawn. But we also have species such as the candy darter and yellowfin madtom, which are small freshwater fish that are endangered. And then we have our, game species such as brook trout and even just our kind of common freshwater species such as black-nosed dace. Next slide. And also, aquatic organisms isn't all about the, traditional fish. It's also about other species such as freshwater eels, which are still a fish, but you don't really think about them when you think about, aquatic species or freshwater mussels. And we also have semi-aquatic organisms such as salamanders and turtles, and even our really small freshwater organisms like macroinvertebrates. But, they're kind of aquatic organisms is a big umbrella, and all these species kind of fall under it. But what's important to note is that they all have different life cycle needs and different habitats that they seek out at different points in their lives. And so having connected streams and rivers is really important for them to, meet those needs and really thrive in aquatic environments. Next slide. And so then road stream crossings, which just like the name suggests, is where you have a road that crosses a stream. And typically at road stream crossings, you're going to have some type of structure present that lets the stream flow underneath the road. Next slide. But what a lot of people don't realize is that here in Virginia, we have close to 150,000 road stream crossings. And each one of these crossings is a potential barrier to aquatic organisms and moving up and down the system. So with so many crossings, we can really create these super fragmented systems that don't allow for organisms to move around and to meet those different life cycle needs and find those different habitats. Next slide. And so, the rest of the talk today, we're going to kind of focus on culverts. And that's one of the most common types of structures that we see at road stream crossings. And they also tend to cause the most problems for aquatic organisms moving up and down stream. Next slide. So most culvert crossings that you see, they've been designed by an engineer, but the kind of the issue with it is that when engineers design these crossings, they're designing them really, what they're really looking at are these large flow events, these floods, and how the crossing is going to perform in those events. Is the pipe the right size to convey the flood without overtopping the road? And what they kind of overlook is how is that pipe going to interact with low flow conditions, which is what we see in streams and rivers 90% of the time. Next slide. And so what we find is that these culverts during low flow conditions, they're creating barriers to aquatic organisms. There's a couple different type of barriers that we, typically see. One being a velocity barrier, that the water in the pipe is just moving too fast for organisms to move through. We also see vertical barriers where we have a vertical drop at the outlet of the culvert pipe. And you think back to that candy darter. The candy darter is not jumping 2 feet out of the water and swimming upstream. And another type of barrier we see is the water's too shallow in the pipe and the organisms aren't able to move through it. And sometimes you'll end up with all three conditions where you have a culvert where the water's just moving too fast, it's too shallow, and you still have that vertical drop. Next slide. So about 30 years ago, some group of people at the Forest Service made up of engineers, fish biologists, hydrologists, they got together and they realized that the impact that road stream crossings were having on the aquatic resources that they managed. And they wanted to find a new way to design road stream crossings. And that's where they came up with this idea of stream simulation. And stream simulation, it's a whole method, but kind of the summary of it is you go from crossings like this on the left, where the water is moving too fast and too shallow in the pipe, to crossings that look like this one on the right, where you have a full-blown stream inside the culvert. Here inside the structure, we have stream bed, we have stream banks, and we even have floodplain benches that can allow for a dry passage. And so it's kind of a new way for engineers to approach designing these crossings. But something to kind of point out is that when the Forest Service put together this new approach, what they were really focused on is aquatic organism passage. That's all the method was kind of designed for initially, was how can we, create natural conditions for aquatic species to move upstream and downstream. Next slide. But what we've kind of learned over time from the Forest Service and others, and it's been documented, is that the benefits of the stream simulation approach goes well beyond just benefits for aquatic species. There's benefits for terrestrial organisms by providing that dry passage. There's also stream sim crossings require way less maintenance, and so you're not having to send maintenance crews out on a monthly or every other month basis to clean the culvert out and fix things around the structure. And really reducing the maintenance costs kind of pays for these structures over their lifespan. But then there's also benefits for public safety by keeping the stream sim crossings, they don't get blown out as often. And so you get a big flood and your road network still is intact and vehicles can access areas that they need to access. And it reduces flood hazards downstream by having these redesigned crossings in place. And then kind of the last benefit that I'll touch on is just it's kind of a a resilient approach to designing road stream crossings. Like the stream sim method, you look at a bunch of different scenarios and a bunch of different potential things that could happen at the crossing, and you kind of design your new crossing around that. And so that really allows us to have resilient infrastructure when we follow the stream sim method, because our crossings are now, they can adjust with the dynamic nature of streams and the environment around them instead of just being a static, 24-inch pipe that the stream flows through. Last slide. So I know that was a lot of information, but thank you for your time today. And if you have any questions about aquatic organism passage or stream simulation, definitely feel free to reach out to me at the email below.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ben. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the General Assembly and how policy can support wildlife crossings. So Misty from Wildlands Network is going to talk a little bit about what's already been done in Virginia.
Hi, thanks, Connor. My name is Misty Bose. I'm the U.S. Conservation Policy Manager at the Wildlands Network, and I was fortunate enough to have their help as we were working our way through our first iterations of policy here in Virginia. And now I actually work for them, and I help other states, including Virginia, pass wildlife crossing legislation throughout the country. So I clearly got excited about this, and so I'm excited to tell you about our journey. So I just wanted to start by kind of laying the groundwork. As we've heard today, you all know Virginia faces a really significant challenge with our wildlife vehicle collisions, and they obviously have serious consequences for both our driver safety and our wildlife. Just to put some numbers on this, there's about 60,000 deer collisions alone, and that's probably an underestimate, as we know. And those cost us about an estimated $41,000 per incident. And as we heard from Dan at the beginning of the hour, these crashes and those close calls can cause multiple fatalities and probably, again, an unknown number of injuries. Currently, according to State Farm, Virginia ranks as a high-risk state, the 10th highest in the nation for wildlife vehicle collisions. So we've got a big problem that we need to handle. But the good news is, as we've heard tonight, wildlife crossings and wildlife corridor protection are really proven solutions to this problem. The question is how to get it done. For instance, wildlife researcher Bridget Donaldson, who's fantastic at the Virginia Transportation Research Council, actually ran a study to see how much we could reduce collisions with some relatively minor interventions. And what she did is she studied a known hotspot for wildlife vehicle collisions right on I-64 between Charlottesville and Crozet. And what she did was she put some fencing around existing underpasses to see if she could funnel deer and other wildlife into using those instead of crossing the road where they were getting hit. So they had to travel under the road rather than over. And she found some really fantastic results. In less than 2 years, her project effectively paid for the infrastructure itself and led to a 96% reduction in wildlife collisions. And so I honestly actually breathe a sigh of relief whenever I go across that section of I-64 between Charlottesville and Crozet, because that's where we know we have a less of a chance of hitting wildlife. So this is where we started, right? This is how Virginia got here. This is where I was at, several years ago, back in 2018, when we were starting to try to get our head around this problem as a state. And so we started bringing folks together in 2018. That was our convening. And we started the Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative. We call it VSWC because that's a terribly long name. But our goal was to try to protect people and wildlife by reducing animal vehicle collisions. And we also wanted to make sure once animal crosses a road, it has somewhere safe to go afterwards. So we want to protect their safe passage across the landscape as well. This group included nonprofits, researchers, agency representatives, anyone we could find who'd been thinking about this. And we found there were a lot of people who had been thinking about this. And so we started working together, meeting regularly and seeing what we could do. Shortly after that, in 2020, a subset of us that were able to work on policy, we separated out from the group and we started working on legislation through the General Assembly. And we worked to pass SB 1004. And what this legislation did is it directed state agencies to create a wildlife corridor action plan. And I know plans don't sound exciting. I don't get excited by plans either. But what it does is allows us to identify barriers to wildlife movement, prioritize and recommend crossing projects, and then create an actual public facing map that shows where the high priority areas are for wildlife corridor infrastructure. And this planning, even though planning is just planning, it laid the foundation for all the next steps and all the foundation we could build on. So after that plan had been created in 2023, the first version of the plan came out, and VDOT actually won one of the first federal wildlife crossing pilot program grants from the federal government. And what that allowed us to do here at the state was to fine tune our priorities, fine tune our plan, really add in more species, consider all of the things we needed to be considering, and for the first time actually get funding to work on this problem in the state, which was really exciting. And by 2024, because of, again, that plan, wildlife crossings were weighted in the new Virginia Land Conservation Foundation grant manual. And what that means is that state funds were now able to flow towards protecting priority wildlife corridors identified in that plan. And it allowed us to start giving money to the issue, start giving money to those places that were important. And similarly, the wildlife mapping of the wildlife corridors in that plan was instrumental in securing federal funding from NOAA's Climate Ready Coast initiative to protect over 1,900 acres of forest in Southeast Virginia. That wouldn't have happened without the plan in place. And it's going to be dedicated to the Natural Areas Preserve System. This area is kind of near the Great Dismal Swamp, if you know that area. And it's one of the state's most significant hotspots of biodiversity with over 100 species of high conservation need. So really exciting things came out of our plan, and just some folks getting together and asking, what can we do? What do we need to be working on? How can we all work together to make this happen? And so last year, I'm very excited to report, we were so happy to see that the Virginia legislature actually dedicated $450,000 in funding for wildlife crossings. That's the first time that's ever happened in the state. And that's because of all of these stages of policy that we'd worked through and all of these efforts that had happened before. So what now? What are the next steps? What do we want to see happen next, right? This is great. $450,000 is wonderful. We have a wonderful plan. We've got some great things in place, but this is only the beginning. We're still behind other states. We're still behind other countries. There's still a big problem in our state. And we really want to see wildlife crossings baked into how we plan roads, and not like a problem we go back and solve later. Not only isn't that sensible, it also costs a lot more money to plan in that way, right? So to do that, we need money. And that's why this year in our legislation, we're going to be asking for a wildlife corridor grant fund so that we can do all of the work that's been identified in the wildlife corridor action plan that the state wrote. So I'll stop now and I'll let Connor tell you about our specific policy asks this year and how you can actually get involved and help us do it. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Misty. So Ellie, if you can go to the next slide. Awesome. So Misty set me up great. So we have a bunch of policy goals for the coming legislative session. And the biggest one is to establish that fund, which we're calling the Wildlife Corridor and Crossing Grant Fund. And so this is a pot where money will be able to be spent on building crossings as well as maintaining them, doing more research. And having a fund in place will also allow the state to more easily apply for federal funding and any other sources of funding that might be out there. And so we really want to establish this fund. And in addition to establishing it, we want to find long-term sources of money to keep money in the fund. And so there's a couple different options that we're exploring and hoping to pass in the coming legislative session. These include a donation option, a voluntary checkbox when you register your vehicle to donate a small fund, a small amount of money to the fund, and then hopefully a larger source of money from a tax on data centers. That entire tax will go to a variety of conservation initiatives if passed, including things like state park funding, but part of it would hopefully go to our wildlife corridor fund. So we'll see, how those different funding mechanisms play out, but hopefully we can get that fund established and get some dedicated funding put into it. In addition to the money, we also want to improve planning for wildlife crossings, like Misty mentioned. So we want agencies to be thinking about wildlife from the beginning of infrastructure projects like redoing a road or building a new road, and as well as in their like long-term plans. So to do that, we want to increase agency collaboration between groups like the Department of Transportation and the Department of Wildlife Resources. We also want to increase collaboration between agencies and localities to assist localities in pursuing the crossing goals that they have, because it's very difficult without state support for them to do that. We also want to train agency staff, for example, at the Department of Transportation about wildlife crossings so that they have some background knowledge. Feels like a lot of agency staff working on, say, like highway construction might not know that much about wildlife crossings. And if they have some background knowledge and are thinking about it from the beginning, will be better equipped to incorporate those considerations from the start so that we can, incorporate these projects when, a highway is being widened or something, instead of having to go back after the fact and put a crossing in as an entirely separate project, when that might not be necessary. And then we also want to expand data collection to improve our plan for the future. VDOT has an app where they track where they remove animal carcasses from the road. And they use this app in some parts of the state, but we would love for them to expand that use statewide to really have better data on where animals are hit and better identify hotspots where we need crossings. So those are our big policy goals, and the Virginia legislative session is really short. It runs from mid-January to mid-March, and so we don't have a ton of time to, try and get multiple bills passed, but we'll be, working hard to do that, and that really makes right now the best time to be building support and speaking up and, letting people know that you care about this issue and that these things are important for the state to do. And so Environment Virginia's intern, Nick, is going to tell you about a great way for you to get involved and support these efforts by writing a letter to the editor.
Hi, thanks, Connor. I'm Nick, and as Connor just mentioned, I'm going to be talking about writing a letter to the editor, or LTE for short. And yeah, basically just one method that you can exercise to get involved in public discourse and help the wildlife corridor cause. Next slide. So what are they? Just some background information. LTEs, they're concise letters to newspapers from passionate citizens about whatever issues they care about. And you can see from these 4 examples, they can be on any topic, but they're more often published if they reference or in response to an article that was previously published in that same paper. So for example, you've seen an article in your local paper about a highway getting an additional lane or a new culvert being implemented at some stream river crossing area. If you write an LTE in response to that references wildlife corridors, maybe interjects a personal story, that's got a greater chance of getting published as opposed to a LTE that just is sent in without that direct link, without that association or dialogue with the newspaper that they really appreciate. Secondly, it's important to note the word count. Now, this varies from newspaper to newspaper, but generally ranges from about 250 to 350 words. So pretty short, which makes it not super time consuming, but sometimes can make it difficult to make your ideas feel felt and potent, but while still remaining underneath that limit. And one last thing to keep in mind as well is that it helps if your LTE has a personal touch and stays really focused on 1 or 2 key ideas, just drives the point home and makes it really impactful. Next slide. So for the importance of them, LTEs, they're a frequently read section of the newspaper, not only by the general public, but also by legislators. So they'll often look at this column, this section, just to get a better understanding, get a good grasp of the general public and their constituents' feelings about current issues. They're a simple way to get involved, as I mentioned before. With that pretty short word count, they're accessible, not really time consuming, and it's an easier ask to put on your family, friends, if you think that they feel similarly about wildlife corridors or any other cause. Just ask them, 250, 300 words, you send it over the newspaper, it can always help, doesn't hurt. Third, it's a good way for us to expand and maintain our support. So, published LTEs, they can get in front of a lot of eyes and make people who might not have been aware of wildlife corridors aware of them, or it just might open up a new level of care that somebody might not realize they've had. They read a personal story about somebody who they find out lives near them, went through something similar. They might feel a certain level of extra impetus to get involved. And LTEs also just keep our ideas in the minds of readers, call back the importance. If somebody feels like they've forgotten about wildlife corridors and slipped their mind, it's a good way to just bring that back to the forefront. And finally, LTEs, they're easily transformed into letters to elected officials, legislators. So, if unfortunately your LTE doesn't get published in a newspaper, which of course we hope they all do, it's pretty simple to take that letter, edit it, maybe shorten it, lengthen it, whatever needs to be done, and send it over to your elected officials, your state senators, legislators. And so if that happens to be the case, or if that's just the way that you prefer to get involved, I can also put the link to the Virginia General Assembly's Who is My Legislator in the chat. It makes it super simple. Just put in your address or your zip code and it does the work for you. Next slide. And finally, here's just a resource that we have to help in the assistance and process of writing LTEs from the inception all the way to sending them. So it's our Wildlife Crossing Letter to the Editor Toolkit. And it begins with some basic background information for wildlife corridors, along with Environment Virginia's current goals that Connor just mentioned. But it just has them there just to reference as you do your writing. And then it'll also include sections on writing tips, specific wildlife corridor facts with notable figures, some of which have already been mentioned in the webinar today, but also just there to keep in mind and remind. And the toolkit also has an example of a published LTE to use as a reference, just model your writing off of, maybe take some style points from it, that sort of thing. And finally, it's got a variety of links to Virginia newspapers and links to their LTE submission forms or emails, whichever way they accept letters. And yeah, I believe that's pretty much it for me. I'll put the link for the toolkit as well in the chat. But yeah, thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. So yeah, hopefully people can get involved, write an LTE, and help spread the word about this to your local community, write in your local paper, and then it's a great way to reach a lot of people at once. So that is the conclusion of our speaker portion. Now we can open it up for questions. I also have the contact information up for all the speakers if you're interested in reaching out directly to them. But yeah, if people want to put questions in the Q&A function, we can respond to any questions that people have.
Connor, is it okay if I ask a question?
Absolutely.
So maybe this is a combination of you and Misty. Have you explored insurance companies as a way of funding these types of mechanisms, whether they're car insurance, health insurance? Yeah.
Maybe Misty could speak to that.
I am happy to take that one. Yes, that comes up a lot, as it should, right? Because these companies are clearly paying out, money for these things. However, I worked with some legislators up in Maryland last year who actually required their state agent or state insurance companies to prepare a report. And they said, how is this working? Are you passing the costs on to consumers? And if so, in which ways? And it pretty clearly showed they are in numerous ways, passing that cost on to consumers. So while insurance companies are paying out, I think they're finding ways to not pay. However, I don't want to paint them in a bad light. There are insurance companies that are getting on board now and are starting to work with us on this issue, especially in North Carolina. I just happen to know about that. And same in Maryland, they're starting to, get behind the issue. But yeah, I think that's the problem, right? It's so easy to pass the cost along that it hasn't been a major issue. But I would, like we've always heard, I would love to see the Gecko crossing, on the on I-64.
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat, so I think everyone just did such an amazing job of thoroughly covering their topics. I felt like everyone did amazing, so I think that must be true. Does anybody have any other questions before we hop off?
Jordan asked in the chat about health insurance companies for the human injuries, so not just the road accidents, but you know, is that part of what you also investigated, Misty?
Yeah, I've had some conversations about that. I don't feel confident speaking to that, like, confidently, but similarly, I would imagine, insurance companies are pretty good at, making that work for themselves. But again, that is another amazing a group that we could be working with, right? And reducing costs for everyone. And they're hopefully they care about their, folks as well. And we can, find common ground there. So no, I don't think that's impossible by any stretch, but those have not been actively utilized avenues as far as I've heard so far.
John, there's a question for you in the chat now about adjacent land security when you're looking at crossings.
Yeah, but we're factoring in the corridors, the wildlife corridors, and the access from the wildlife point of view, in terms of security and sort of land ownership. We haven't explicitly tackled that, but I think that is something that is firmly in, Bridget Donaldson's radar in terms of where can you actually put fencing, where can you augment the approach to a crossing structure. And so within the 10 hotspots that we have at Loudoun County, there's varying different degrees of public access or right of way around the area immediately by the crossing. And so that I know that that's factoring into the VDOT level and the DWR level of decision making. That's going into trying to assign the 450,000 that's available within Virginia.
Yeah, I do believe that it's definitely a factor that some people looking into like crossing projects are considering. Definitely it's a benefit if it's connected, like already protected land that's in a conservation easement or a state park or something, because then the land won't be developed. But deer also, definitely exist in suburban, semi-urban communities and will still cross the road even if it's not, a super nice protected habitat.
Yeah, even in the areas with the very lowest biodiversity, there are deer. We found, I mean, the deer are everywhere. It's the degrees to which the deer are there that is sort of really affecting the risk factor, and then the design of the approach to the road itself.
Yeah. Ben, there's a question for you in the chat as well. Are there any particular hotspots of habitat disturbance for aquatic wildlife in Virginia? I don't know if Ben is there. Are you there, Ben?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find that question. Oh, I see it in the chat. I wouldn't say that there's any, hot spots. There's definitely, we have like, I guess we can use the candy darter, for example. Like the candy darter only occurs in a couple watersheds. And so if you're looking at trying to recover candy darter populations, you would only target those watersheds. And so when you have species that you're specifically targeting, then you can definitely find those kind of hot spots or those crossings that need to be upgraded. But then just kind of looking at like a bigger picture for impacts on aquatic resources, like, streams all across the state have aquatic organisms in there, and there's crossings all across the state that are fragmenting, those streams and rivers. And so if you're trying to recover species, you can definitely find hotspots, but, probably a bigger picture, we, we as engineers need to rethink how we're designing road stream crossings.
There's another question about research, asking if anyone has studied opportunistic predation on prey animals at underpasses or crossings where animals are funneled. I haven't personally come across that, but maybe John or someone else would know more.
No, I've not come across that either. We did consider that, like we were wondering from the trail cam images whether we would see anything like that, whether there would be any coyote predation, especially. We didn't see any in our records, and I've not heard people call that out before. But it is a possibility, right? If we are funneling prey species to a particular point, that might become a point that predators learn that there are prey there commonly. And so that might be something we need to consider further. I wouldn't rule that out. I know that in some of the other work that I do, you know, on window collisions with birds, we know that some predatory birds actually flush small birds into windows to stun them and then pick the birds off the ground. So, predators can be pretty smart about using human-built structures to influence their prey.
I had not heard that before. That's an interesting point. Sort of scary. Crapper from Wild Virginia says that predators and prey are often using crossings at different times of day, so there might be less overlap.
Yeah, and the research I've looked at suggests that overpasses very unlikely. Underpasses can be more of a concern, especially for smaller creatures if it's small and narrow and long. But yeah, overall, still the benefits far outweigh the drawbacks.
Awesome. Well, are there any other final questions that people have? I'm not seeing any. So thank you again to all of the speakers for joining and taking the time to prepare and speak tonight. And thank you everyone for joining to learn more about wildlife crossings. Yeah, feel free to reach out to me or any of the other panelists if you have any questions.
Thanks, Connor.
Awesome. And we'll also post the recording online. So if you missed any of it or want to share it around with people who weren't able to make it, you can also do that.